Welcome back to the Book Nook, everyone.
Hey there. It is so good to be here for another deep dive.
Yeah, we are so excited you're joining us today. Usually when we talk about the history of science or, medicine, there is this underlying expectation of absolute precision.
Oh, absolutely. Like, it has to be mathematically perfect.
Exactly. It's like structural engineering. If you break your arm, the X-ray shows this jagged white line on a black background, and the doctor simply points at it and says, well, there is the fracture.
Right. It provides this deeply comforting binary reality for us.
It really does.
Because we inherently want our diagnostics to be visible. We want them to be neatly categorized, placed into perfectly labeled boxes that our rational minds can process without any lingering ambiguity.
But the thing is, the moment you step into the world of human consciousness, and specifically into the murky origins of modern depth psychology, that X-ray machine just completely shatters.
It's gone.
Yeah, we are no longer looking at a clean bone fracture. We are navigating a diagnostic landscape that is chaotic, mythological, and entirely untethered from physical geometry. We're essentially looking at an untamed wilderness.
And, no one mapped the terrifying topography of that wilderness quite like Carl Jung.
Nobody even came close.
No, they really didn't. And the text we are examining today for our deep dive, the Red Book, which is also known as Liber Novus, or the New Book, edited by Sonu Shamdasani, is the literal map of that expedition.
It's incredible.
I mean, it is almost impossible to overstate the gravity of this text in the history of human thought.
Because the premise of this book borders on the unbelievable. Like, Carl Jung is universally recognized as one of the founding architects of modern psychology, right?
Well, without a doubt.
His frameworks permeate our entire culture, our literature, our cinema, even, corporate HR departments use his stuff.
Right, like personality tests and all that.
Exactly. And yet, the absolute crucible of his life's work, the literal diary of his own psychological descent that he labored over for 16 years, was kept hidden from the public.
Blocked away.
Locked in a literal Swiss bank vault for nearly a century.
It is wild when you actually think about it.
So today, you and I are examining the secret, heavily guarded foundations of modern psychological architecture.
Yes. Our goal in examining these sources today is to really unpack that exact 16-year self-experimentation.
The crucible itself.
Right. This is the molten core that forged the concepts we now throw around so casually today. Introversion, extroversion, the shadow, the collective unconscious, the archetype.
All the big hits.
All of them. And we need to understand the precise mechanics of how a deeply personal, nearly catastrophic psychological crisis was ultimately translated into the clinical frameworks that we rely on today.
Because when you actually crack open the Red Book, it genuinely reads like a high fantasy epic colliding with a theological fever dream.
It really does. It is not a textbook.
Not at all. You have knights in yellowish armor, ancient biblical prophets wandering around, massive serpents, literal rivers of blood.
It's intense.
It is. But if we want to understand how a respected man of science produced something that reads like Dante's Inferno, we really have to strip away our 21st century assumptions about how disciplines are separated.
That is such an important point.
We have to look at the cultural atmospheric pressure of 1913.
That is the essential starting point for this whole thing, because today we have these rigid, impenetrable walls between empirical science, clinical psychology, fine art, and literature, right?
Yeah, everybody stays in their lane.
Exactly. Like, if a modern psychiatrist submitted a paper written in poetic verse about fighting a dragon, their medical license would be under review immediately.
Oh, they'd be left out of the hospital.
But in the early 20th century, those walls were barely under construction. It was an era of intense, cross-pollinating cultural blur.
The lines were so fuzzy.
Super fuzzy. You had brilliant minds actively trying to synthesize the empirical with the mystical.
Yeah, the sources mention W.B. Yeats, for instance. He was utilizing spiritualistic automatic writing to bypass his conscious mind and compose poetry.
Which is fascinating.
And the surrealists were doing the exact same thing, trying basically hotwire the unconscious. But it wasn't just the artists encroaching on science. The scientists were heavily encroaching on art.
Exactly. Major foundational psychologists were deeply involved in artistic and spiritual exploration.
Like who?
Well, people like Alfred Binet, who was the inventor of the first usable intelligence test.
Oh, wow, the IQ test guy.
Right. And Charles Richet, a Nobel-winning physiologist. They were writing dramatic fiction under assumed names.
That is wild.
And Gustav Fechner, who essentially founded experimental psychology, he wrote extensive treatises on the soul life of plants.
The soul life of plants.
Yeah. because the scientific community was desperately searching for a new language. European society as a whole was kind of suffocating under a profound cultural and spiritual crisis at the time.
Right, Hugo Ball, one of the founders of the Dada movement, he captured that suffocating mood perfectly.
He really did.
He described 1913 Europe as a place where life felt completely shackled by a heavy, grinding economic fatalism.
That phrase, economic fatalism, is so heavy.
It is, because the Industrial Revolution had promised this grand utopia, but it really just delivered mechanization. People were just cogs in a machine.
And the traditional church, which had historically provided the existential safety net for people, was increasingly viewed as an empty, mechanized redemption factory.
A redemption factory, wow.
Yeah, one that offered no real spiritual nourishment. So people were looking around at this hyper-rationalized world and asking, is this it? Is there any force capable of breaking us out of this sterile cage?
And what makes Jung the perfect lightning rod for this era is that the cultural split of 1913 perfectly mirrored a profound, lifelong internal split within his own mind.
Yes, the macro mirror the micro.
Exactly. To grasp the mechanics of the Red Book, we really have to trace that fracture back to his childhood in Keswell, Switzerland. He was growing up near the Rhine Falls as the son of a Swiss Reformed Church pastor.
Right, a pastor's kid. But he was the furthest thing from your typical well-adjusted pastor's kid.
Definitely not well-adjusted.
No, even as a young boy, Jung experienced incredibly vivid, terrifying hallucinations. And he developed a distinct internal framework to make sense of them.
He had to survive it.
Yeah. He basically identified two entirely separate personalities operating within his own psyche.
Right. He classified them as personality number 1 and personality number 2.
Exactly.
So personality number 1 was the pragmatic, forward-looking, science-minded Basel schoolboy. This was the part of him that read novels, did his homework, and functioned in everyday linear time.
A normal kid.
Right. But personality number 2 was entirely alien to the modern world. This was a solitary, deeply religious spirit that felt intimately tethered to the Middle Ages.
So eerie.
It is. It was connected to the cosmos and to ancient history. Jung actually noted that when personality number 2 took over, the atmosphere shifted completely. It felt as though a long-dead, yet perpetually present spirit had literally stepped into the room.
And that internal friction, the rational, empirical present grinding against the ancient mythological past, that generated a series of childhood visions that were utterly paradigm-shifting for him.
They were shocking. I mean, let's look at the underground temple dream.
Oh, this one is intense.
It is. He's incredibly young, perhaps 3 or 4 years old. He dreams he is in a meadow and discovers a dark, stone-lined hole in the ground.
Just a classic ominous start.
Right. He descends the stairs and finds this opulent golden throne. But sitting on the throne isn't a king. It's a massive, fleshy tree trunk made of human skin with a single, unblinking eye on top.
Terrifying for a toddler.
And from the darkness, he hears his mother's voice warning him that this entity is the man-eater. Later in life, Jung realized he dreamed of an ancient underground ritual phallus.
Which is just a huge amount of symbolic weight for a 4-year-old brain to process.
Absolutely.
The psychological impact of that dream was seismic. It permanently altered his relationship with religion and his father's church.
How so?
So he didn't view this grotesque image as just a nightmare to be forgotten, He viewed it as a profound initiation into the secrets of the earth.
The secrets of the earth, right.
Yeah, it was a primal, chthonic spirituality that stood in stark, glaring contrast to the sanitized, dogmatic, and honestly lifelong religion his father preached from the pulpit every Sunday.
Right. It felt more real to him than church. But the real breaking point, the vision that permanently solidified his understanding of the human mind, occurred when he was 12.
The cathedral vision.
Yes. It's a beautiful, sunny afternoon. He's walking through the square in Basel, admiring the newly restored, gleaming, glazed roof tiles of the cathedral.
Just a nice day out.
And out of nowhere, he feels this crushing, terrifying, deeply sinful thought approaching his consciousness. He knows that if he thinks it, he will be damned.
He's terrified of his own brain.
Right. He fights it in sheer agony for days. But eventually, his logic shifts. He reasons that God is omnipotent, right?
Right.
Which means God wants him to think this thought, just as God meticulously orchestrated the fall of Adam and Eve.
That's a huge rationalization for a kid.
It is. So he surrenders. He lowers his psychological defenses and lets the thought manifest. And he experiences a waking vision of God sitting on a golden throne high above the world, unleashing a massive cosmic turd that plummets down, completely obliterating the new roof and shattering the cathedral to pieces.
It is a violently transgressive image.
It is, and this is where I really have to pause and look at the cultural contrast. Because if a 12-year-old child today sat down in a clinician's office and calmly explained that they were having vivid waking hallucinations of God destroying a church with excrement, the clinical response would be immediate.
Oh, red flags everywhere.
Exactly. They would be fiercely pathologized, diagnosed with a severe psychotic disorder, and heavily medicated to suppress those images.
Institutionalized, probably.
Yeah. But Jung's reaction wasn't terror or madness. The moment the vision concluded, he experienced this overwhelming euphoric sense of bliss and grace.
Which is the exact opposite of what you'd expect.
Right. He interpreted it as a profound, direct awakening to a living God who operates completely outside the sterile confines of human theology. Why did he process a psychotic-seeming break as a moment of divine grace?
Because for Jung, that specific vision was the exact moment the concept of psychic objectivity crystallized.
Psychic objectivity.
Yes. He realized in a visceral way that inner experiences, images generated by the unconscious, are objectively real.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means they carry a psychological weight, a structural reality, and an undeniable power that is entirely independent of the physical outside world.
So they are real things, just not physical things.
Exactly. He looked at his father, the struggling pastor, and realized his father was drowning in empty dogma because he lacked this direct, unmediated experience of the divine.
He was just reading words on a page.
Right. But Jung had experienced the terrifying living fire. This revelation that the inner world is a tangible, objective environment that demands to be explored became the bedrock of his entire psychiatric career.
It set the stage for everything.
It really did. It provided the framework he needed to eventually fuse the rigorous empirical science of personality number 1 with the mythological, humanities-driven depths of personality number 2.
And for a long time, that fusion made him arguably the most formidable psychiatrist of his generation. I mean, he goes to medical school, he thrives, he takes a position at the highly progressive Berg-Holtzley Hospital under the pioneering Eugen Bleuler.
They were doing incredible work there.
They were at the absolute cutting edge, studying dementia precox, which we now call schizophrenia. Jung is conducting these incredibly rigorous, mathematically precise word association experiments to map out what he termed complexes.
That was a huge breakthrough.
It was. And then he enters the orbit of Sigmund Freud.
The heavy hitter. And, it's crucial to understand that when Jung and Freud met, Jung wasn't just some eager student sitting at the master's feet.
He wasn't a nobody.
Not at all. The Berg-Holtzley team, spearheaded by Bleuler and Jung, had essentially legitimized psychoanalysis in the German-speaking psychiatric world. Jung was a powerhouse in his own right.
So it was a meeting of equals, in a way?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Their collaboration was electric because they shared this profound revolutionary focus on the unconscious mind and the psychogenesis of mental disorders.
The idea that mental illness stems from psychological conflicts, not just brain lesions.
Exactly. Jung's star rose rapidly, culminating in him becoming the first president of the International Psychoanalytical Association. By all external metrics, he was at the absolute zenith of his profession.
But the architecture of psychoanalysis was built on a fault line. Just as he reaches this pinnacle, he publishes a massive, sprawling text in 1912 called Transformations and Symbols of the Libido.
A huge turning point.
It's this exhaustive deep dive into ancient mythology, analyzing the fantasies of a young woman named Miss Frank Miller. And the research for this book fundamentally breaks him for two distinct reasons. First, he hits an existential wall.
Yes, the realization of the mythless man.
Right.
He had spent years meticulously dissecting the myths of antiquity, the complex symbol systems of his schizophrenic patients, and the dreams of children. But when he turned that analytical lens inward, he realized he had absolutely no myth of his own to live by.
He was completely empty on the inside.
Yeah. He observed that a modern individual without a myth is entirely uprooted, drifting without a true anchor to the past, the ancestors, or the deep currents of contemporary society.
Which feels so relevant today.
It does. He described his own existence as hovering in an uncertain cloud of theoretical possibilities. It's an incredibly modern affliction, right? Having all the data in the world, but zero underlying meaning.
And this internal void collides violently with his theoretical schism with Freud. In my view, the break between them was inevitable because they fundamentally disagreed on what the unconscious actually was.
They were looking at two different things.
Yeah, Freud's architecture was inherently analytic reductive. Everything had to be traced backward causally, usually terminating in repressed infantile sexuality or childhood trauma.
Right.
The unconscious, in the early Freudian model, functions almost like a psychological basement, where you lock away all the socially unacceptable desires you can't act on.
Just a dark room full of garbage you don't want to look at.
Exactly.
And Jung simply couldn't accept that reductionist view. I mean, while he acknowledged the reality of repression, he saw the unconscious not as a static, a garbage dump of past traumas, but as a dynamic, deeply creative matrix.
There's a life to him.
Yes, he believed the unconscious was constantly attempting to build a bridge to the future, utilizing ancient mythological symbols to guide the individual toward psychological growth.
So it's pulling you forward, not just anchoring you to the past.
Right. To reduce a complex mythological vision merely to a repressed desire to sleep with one's mother felt to Jung like taking a magnificent cathedral and explaining it away by pointing out the chemical composition of the mortar.
That is a brilliant analogy.
It just completely missed the living, transcendent meaning of the psyche.
So the break happens, it's brutal. Jung loses his primary mentor. He resigns from his prestigious institutional positions. He realizes his own life lacks a foundational myth, and he is left completely psychologically unmoored.
Everything falls apart.
The structural supports of his reality just collapse.
And, well, nature abhors a vacuum. With his conscious structures dismantled, the psychological unmooring sets the stage for a terrifying descent into the abyss. The year 1913 arrives, and the floodgates of his mind blast completely open.
Literally a flood.
Literally.
Let's look at the apocalyptic visions of October 1913 because they are staggering. Jung is on a mundane train journey to Schaffhausen.
Just a normal day.
Right. He's sitting in his compartment, looking out the window at the passing landscape, when his conscious reality is suddenly overridden by a massive waking vision.
Just out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. He watches as the entire map of Europe is inundated by a catastrophic flood. But as he looks closer, he realizes it isn't water. It is a surging sea of blood, stretching all the way from the Alps to the shores of the North Sea.
That is horrifying.
He sees the floating wreckage of civilization and countless unburied bodies caught in the yellow waves. And this isn't a momentary flash of intrusive thought, He is locked into this visceral, horrifying hallucination for an entire hour.
An hour of just pure terror.
Yes, and just to confirm that his mind is truly breaking, 2 weeks later, on the exact same train route, the vision repeats itself, but with even greater intensity. An inner voice explicitly tells him that this sea of blood will become a complete reality.
We really have to evaluate this from the perspective of a master clinician.
Right, he's not a layman.
No, Jung wasn't a naive mystic. He was one of the world's leading experts on severe psychiatric illness. He knew the precise taxonomy of madness.
He knew what it looked like from the outside.
Exactly. So he evaluated his own symptoms and genuinely believed he was, using the clinical terminology of the era, doing a schizophrenia.
Doing a schizophrenia.
Yeah. He thought he was actively spiraling into terminal psychosis. He looked at his beautiful family, his incredibly successful private practice, his wealth, and concluded that he was simply an overcompensated psychotic whose defenses were finally failing.
That is so tragic to think about.
And throughout that winter, the visions persisted. He would look toward the northern horizon and see a continuous blood-red glow, like a flicker of a distant, massive fire. When colleagues asked him for his analysis of current world events, he felt completely paralyzed. He told them he had no thoughts anymore. He could only see rivers of blood.
It's the ultimate nightmare for a psychiatrist. I mean, he's preparing a highly technical lecture on the clinical markers of schizophrenia for a medical congress in Aberdeen, Scotland.
Oh, the irony.
And he's terrified, thinking to himself, I'll be speaking of my own mind. I'll probably go completely mad immediately after reading out this paper. He is literally bracing for permanent institutionalization.
But then, history violently intervenes. August 1914 arrives, and the geopolitical powder keg ignites. World War I breaks out.
The impossible happens.
Suddenly, the catastrophic flood of blood he had watched sweeping across the map of Europe is no longer a hallucination. It is the stark, brutal reality of trench warfare and mechanized slaughter.
The psychological whiplash of that moment must have been incomprehensible.
Truly.
The sources detail that when he finally received the news that war had been declared, he was disembarking from a ship in Holland, and despite the global tragedy, nobody was happier or more relieved than him.
Which, out of context, sounds incredibly morbid and sociopathic.
It really does. But for Jung, millions of people going to war meant he wasn't going insane. It was pure, undeniable vindication.
It was the defining turning point of his intellectual life. In a flash of insight, Jung realized that his visions were not this subjective, pathological ravings of a crumbling brain. They were objective precognitions of a massive collective event.
Wow.
This was the empirical proof he needed for his theory of the collective unconscious. He realized that beneath the personal unconscious, the layer of individual memories and repressions, there is a vastly deeper, older subsoil of the human mind that is universally shared across the entire species.
I often think about this mechanism like a radio. We usually assume our minds are closed, self-contained hard drives playing our own files.
Write our own MP3s.
Exactly. But Jung realized the mind is actually an antenna, and his antenna had suddenly tuned into a terrifying hidden frequency that no one else was picking up yet.
That's a great way to look at it.
He was intercepting the immense atmospheric pressure of a continent that was psychologically preparing to rip itself apart. But it raises a profound historical hypothetical for me.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if the Archduke wasn't assassinated, if diplomatic channels had somehow maintained peace in Europe and the war hadn't happened, would Jung have simply checked himself into the Burkoltzli as a patient?
Wow.
Would he have written off his own brilliant mind as hopelessly diseased, ensuring we never got the Red Book, never got the concepts of introversion or the collective unconscious?
It is entirely plausible that he would have succumbed to the clinical diagnosis. The outbreak of the First World War provided the external anchor that gave him the courage to trust the integrity of his own mind.
It saved him, in a dark way.
It did. He recognized that the boundary between the isolated individual psyche and sweeping global events is highly permeable. The collective trajectory of humanity is prefigured and dreamed in the deep unconscious of the individual long before it manifests in reality.
That is just wild to think about.
And armed with that terrifying but profoundly validating realization, Jung made a radical choice. Instead of medicating these inner images or running from them, he realized he had an ethical and scientific obligation to explore them. He had to map the abyss.
Which brings us to the actual mechanical creation of the Red Book. Jung decides to intentionally dive into the darkness of his own mind. But how exactly does a rigorous scientist systematically induce a confrontation with the unconscious without losing his grip on reality?
Very carefully.
Yeah, he developed a technique he eventually termed active imagination, though in the beginning he wryly referred to it as his boring method. How did this work on a practical psychological level?
It was a highly disciplined, incredibly difficult form of self-experimentation. The goal of active imagination is to lower the threshold of consciousness just enough to allow unconscious material to surface, but without falling asleep or losing the critical observing ego.
You have to stay awake and aware.
Exactly. Jung would sit in his study, completely isolate himself, and systematically switch off his rational, directed thinking. He would silence personality number one.
Turn off the scientist.
Right. He would then allow spontaneous fantasy images to rise up. The first time he successfully initiated this, in December 1913, he closed his eyes and fantasized that he was digging a physical hole in the ground.
Okay, so just visualizing a simple action.
But the crucial shift was that he didn't just watch this fantasy passively, like a film projected on a screen. He stepped into it. He treated the fantasy landscape as a perfectly real, objective drama, actively walking through the environment and engaging in dialogue with the figures he encountered.
It's essentially lucid dreaming while completely awake, but treating the dream figures not as your own creations, but as autonomous entities with their own agency.
Exactly.
And he didn't pull this method entirely out of thin air. He was synthesizing a deep background in both spiritualism and historical religious practices, right?
Yes, he had done his homework.
During his university years, he had meticulously observed seances conducted by his cousin Helene Preiswerk. He watched how mediums utilized trance states and automatic writing to channel different personalities. Jung essentially stripped the mystical woo-woo away from those occult practices and weaponized them into rigorous psychological tools.
Precisely. He was also deeply familiar with historical religious exercises, most notably the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Ignatius instructed practitioners to vividly imagine the torments of hell with full, immersive sensory detail. To smell the sulfur, to feel the heat, to hear the screams.
So making the imaginary completely visceral.
Right. Jung adapted these historical techniques to create a method where the conscious ego actively participates, negotiates, and holds tension with the autonomous contents of the unconscious, rather than being passively overwhelmed by them.
And there is a specific pivotal moment during this experimental process that perfectly illustrates the psychological friction involved. Jung is deep in this process, furiously writing down these vivid, chaotic fantasies.
Yeah, he's in the thick of it.
And suddenly he hears a distinct female voice in his head. The voice observes what he is doing and says, "That is art."
Such a strange intervention.
And Jung violently rejects this. He argues fiercely with the voice in his own head, insisting, no, it is not art, it is nature.
This debate over art versus nature is arguably the most important methodological boundary Jung establishes in this whole period.
Why is that distinction so crucial?
Well, Jung identified this autonomous female voice as his anima, which, in his framework, is the personification of the unconscious, the soul, in a man. He recognized instantly that if he agreed with her, if he accepted that his vivid visions were merely art, he would be utilizing a defense mechanism.
Oh, I see.
He would be dismissing these terrifying psychological realities as mere subjective aesthetic fictions.
Mm.
He could comfortably tell himself, oh, I'm just being highly creative. I'm just writing a novel.
Right, because by calling it art, he retains total control over it. The artist is the master of the canvas. You don't have to be afraid of a painting you made.
Exactly.
But by insisting it is nature, he is completely surrendering that control.
Affirming these images as nature meant accepting them as objective, autonomous psychological realities that existed entirely independently of his conscious will. They were natural phenomena. They were as real and uncontrollable as a thunderstorm, a wild animal, or a botanical specimen.
You can't control a thunderstorm. You just observe it.
Right. He realized his duty was not to paint them for an audience, but to study them empirically.
And the sources reveal a fascinating detail about this voice, too. Jung later realized that his anima sounded exactly like a specific Dutch patient of his highly likely Maria Mulzer.
Yes.
She had previously been trying to convince a different psychiatrist that her own unconscious material was just misunderstood artistic expression. It's wild how the unconscious samples the voices of people in our waking lives to construct its avatars.
It really is. It just borrows what it needs.
But Jung absolutely refused to let his inner journey be reduced to aesthetics. He essentially realized he was in a grueling daily psychoanalysis where his analysts were a ghost and an internal woman. He viewed the agonizing process of writing these visions down as composing literal letters to his estranged soul.
And the physical act of documentation became a monumental, nearly punishing task in itself. The evolution of the physical artifact that we now know as the Red Book is a masterclass in psychological integration through meticulous labor.
We have to describe what this object actually is, because the sheer scale of it is stunning. Listeners, picture this evolution. The material didn't spontaneously generate as a massive red tome.
No, it took a long time.
Initially, Jung just furiously scribbled his daily fantasies into a series of unassuming, simple black notebooks, which scholars now refer to as the Black Books.
Just raw, unedited data.
Right. These were the bleeding entries of his descent. Once he had this raw material, he took those entries and transcribed them into a handwritten draft, heavily expanding the text with lyrical commentary, philosophical reflections, and psychological analysis. He was desperately trying to decode the magma he was pulling up.
He was so invested in this stage that he actually had the draft typed out and shared it with a select few trusted confidants, like his friend Carrie Baines, to read and critique.
So he was treating it like a manuscript.
For a brief period, yeah. He was seriously considering publishing the typed manuscript as a psychological treatise.
But something stops him from taking the easy route of the printing press. Instead, he takes this extraordinary detour. He commissions a massive, heavy, folio-sized volume bound in thick red leather from a professional bookbinder.
Just an absolute behemoth of a book.
He procures high-quality parchment and specialized pigments. And over the course of years, he painstakingly copies the text from his draft into this red leather book using flawless medieval-style calligraphy.
It's incredible dedication.
He illuminates the text with breathtaking, intricately detailed mandalas, mythological paintings, and gold leaf. He intentionally structures and formats the entire object to perfectly mimic an illuminated religious manuscript from the Middle Ages. Why go to such agonizing, time-consuming lengths? Why not just hand the typed manuscript to a publisher and be done with it?
Because Jung realized that a modern typewriter fundamentally lacked the psychological gravity required to hold this material.
It was too mundane.
Exactly. He felt a profound obligation to do justice to the immense, timeless weight of the archetypes he was encountering. By treating the text with the reverence traditionally reserved for Holy Scripture, using painstaking calligraphy and vivid illuminations, he was honoring the ancient nature of the unconscious.
He was giving it the respect it demanded.
Yes, he wrote that he felt compelled to catch up with a piece of the Middle Ages that had been lost within his own psyche. The agonizing slowness of calligraphy also served a crucial psychological function. It forced his hyperactive conscious mind to slow down, mechanically grounding the chaotic, explosive energy of his visions into a highly structured physical discipline.
Okay, so he's initiated this massive project. He has opened the heavy door to the collective unconscious, and he's actively walking down the stairs into the subterranean architecture of his own mind.
Step by step.
If he's treating this like a real physical space, his psyche isn't just going to leave it empty. It's going to populate that space with defense mechanisms, fractured pieces of himself, and ancient patterns. So when he walks down those steps, who exactly is waiting for him in the dark? This is where the deep dive feels less like science and more like a surrealist novel.
It really does. The entities he encounters in this space are vivid personifications of deep psychological forces. They are the raw, unintegrated manifestations of what he would later formalize as archetypes.
Let's track the progression. Early in his descent, he runs into an old Austrian customs guard.
Just a normal guy, ostensibly.
Yeah, the man is just wandering around the landscape looking completely lost and irritable. Jung analyzes this and realizes this grumpy old bureaucrat represents Sigmund Freud and his rigid theoretical boundaries, trying to police what is allowed to cross the border of the unconscious.
I love that. It's his mind's way of discarding Freud's framework.
Exactly. And shortly after, he encounters a powerful, imposing knight clad in yellowish armor, carrying a shield with a red Maltese cross.
Stepping way back in time.
Right. This figure represents a deeply rooted, older Christian symbol system that is struggling to resurrect itself in Jung's modern psyche. But the truly tectonic shifts happen when he goes even deeper. Let's break down the encounter with Elijah and Salome.
This is one of the most pivotal encounters in the entire book. Jung descends into a vast, crystalline cosmic space and is confronted by two figures who represent an impossible contradiction.
Yeah, set the scene for us.
He meets Elijah, the wise, venerable, ancient biblical prophet. And standing right beside him is Salome, the blind, hypersexualized, seductive daughter of Herod, the very woman who danced for the severed head of John the Baptist.
A prophet and a seductress.
Yes. And completing this bizarre triad, they are accompanied by a massive black serpent.
It is the ultimate psychological odd couple. A revered holy man, a bloodthirsty blind seductress, and a snake. And they aren't enemies, right? They live together in this crystalline underworld as a family unit.
Right, they coexist perfectly.
Jung's conscious mind is absolutely horrified. He cannot comprehend the moral dissonance. He actually interrogates Elijah, demanding to know how a prophet of God can possibly tolerate living with Salome. And Elijah's response is chillingly calm. He essentially tells Jung, "She is my daughter, and we belong together. You cannot separate us."
The psychological architecture represented here is just brilliant. Elijah is the pure personification of logos. He is reason, forethinking, higher spirituality, intellect, and meaning.
All the lofty stuff.
Exactly. Salome is the pure personification of eros. She is raw feeling, unbridled desire, sensory pleasure, and the physical body. Her blindness is highly symbolic too.
Why is she blind?
Because raw, unrestrained desire is inherently blind. It lacks meaning and direction. But the crucial lesson for Jung is that Elijah without Salome is equally crippled. Pure intellect without physical passion and desire is sterile, detached from reality, and fundamentally lifeless.
So they literally meet each other.
Yes. And the black serpent serves as the connective tissue, the grounding wire connecting both high intellect and base desire to the earth, to nature, and to the darker, chthonic depths of the animal body.
Jung is being forced to realize that his entire life up to that point had been an over-identification with Elijah. He was the brilliant doctor, the intellectual, the thinker. But to achieve actual psychological wholeness, he couldn't just side with the prophet and banish the seductress.
He had to integrate both.
He had to accept, integrate, and actually learn to love the blind, irrational, desirous, and messy parts of himself. He had to love Salome.
That's a hard pill to swallow for a rationalist.
It really is. He even details a profound hallucinatory vision where he performs a mystical ritual to heal her blindness, symbolizing the integration of meaning and desire. But the unconscious is never static, is it? Elijah doesn't remain Elijah forever. As Jung's understanding deepens, the archetype evolves.
Exactly. As Jung continues his active imaginations, the figures undergo alchemical transformations. The biblical Elijah eventually evolves into a far more complex figure named Philemon.
Philemon.
Yes, Philemon is a striking pagan, Egypto-Hellenic guru figure. He first appears to Jung in a vivid dream, descending from the sky with the horns of a bull and the brilliantly colored, massive wings of a kingfisher bird.
I have to interject with a quick historical aside here because the synchronicity involved in that specific image is mind-bending.
Oh, the garden story.
Yes. The sources note that while Jung was in his study physically painting this exact bizarre image of Philemon with the kingfisher wings, he took a break and walked out into his garden by the edge of Lake Zurich. And lying perfectly still on the ground was a dead kingfisher bird.
That is just spooky.
It's insane. Kingfishers are incredibly rare in that region of Switzerland. Jung noted they had never been seen around his house before. It is one of those deeply eerie, inexplicable, meaningful coincidences that would eventually lead Jung to formalize his theory of synchronicity, the causal connecting principle between inner psychological states and outer physical events.
It's like the world was echoing his mind.
Exactly, but returning to the inner world, what was Philemon's specific function in Jung's development?
Philemon was arguably the most crucial teacher Jung encountered in the entire experiment. Jung became so intimately familiar with this figure that he would literally walk up and down his garden paths, holding out-loud conversations with Philemon as if he were a physical mentor walking beside him.
Just chatting with his imagination in the yard.
Yeah, Philemon represented a level of superior transcendent insight that Jung's conscious ego simply did not possess. And Philemon's most vital lesson was hammering home the concept of psychic objectivity.
Let's break that down for the listener again. What does psychic objectivity mean in the context of our everyday lives?
It is a radical reframing of how we experience our own minds. Philemon explained to Jung that the thoughts that arise in your head are not necessarily things that you actively created.
Wait, if I'm thinking them, how did I not create them?
Here's a brilliant analogy for this. Philemon said that thoughts are like animals roaming through a forest or birds flying across the sky. If you step outside and look up and see a bird flying by, you would never point to it and say, I created that bird. That bird is me.
No, you just say, oh, there goes a bird.
Right. You recognize it as an independent entity that you were merely observing. Philemon taught Jung that the conscious ego, the I that we identify with, is just a small, brightly lit room. Thoughts, urges, and images are independent entities that wander in and out of that room from the vast darkness of the unconscious. We do not invent them. We merely experience them.
That is a massive, incredibly liberating paradigm shift. It completely removes the crushing burden of moral guilt we attach to intrusive thoughts. Think back to the 12-year-old Jung agonizing over the vision of the cathedral being destroyed.
He thought he was damned.
Right. But when you achieve psychic objectivity, you realize you didn't invent that terrible thought. It simply visited your conscious room from the depths of the collective unconscious. Your only responsibility is how you choose to react to it, not to feel guilty for its very existence.
Exactly. It's about relationship, not identification.
But if we are going to discuss terrifying thoughts visiting from the darkness, we absolutely must address Abraxas.
Oh, yes. Abraxas.
This is where the Red Book ventures away from psychology and wades deep into highly controversial Gnostic theological waters. Jung writes a dense poetic section called the Septem Sermones ad Mortuos, the Seven Sermons to the Dead. And in this text, Philemon introduces a concept of God that completely shatters the traditional binary of the Christian God and the devil. He introduces a supreme deity named Abraxas.
Before we delve into this, it's really important to clarify for our listeners that we are strictly examining Jung's psychological and symbolic framework as presented in the text here.
Yes, absolutely.
We are exploring how he reconciled the paradoxes of the human mind, not endorsing a specific religious doctrine. But within the cosmology of the Red Book, the concept of Abraxas is truly terrifying.
Terrifying is almost an understatement. Philemon describes Abraxas as a god higher and older than both the Christian God and the devil. Abraxas is the blind, driving force of life itself.
Just pure, unadulterated existence.
He is the mother of both good and evil simultaneously. He seamlessly combines the summum bonum, the absolute highest radiant good drawn from the sun, and the infimum malum, the absolute deepest, most depraved evil drawn from the devil. He is creation and destruction contained in a single indifferent breath.
The language Jung uses to describe him is incredibly potent. He writes that Abraxas is the eternally sucking gorge of emptiness and simultaneously the radiant source of vital force.
It's paradoxical.
Philemon warns that to see Abraxas is blindness and to know him is sickness. He represents the raw, morally indifferent power of existence and nature. Think of a lion brutally tearing apart a gazelle on the savannah.
It's gruesome, but it's nature.
Right. That act isn't morally evil, and the gazelle's life isn't morally good. It is simply the brutal, explosive, vital force of biological reality asserting itself. That indifferent, terrifying totality is Abraxas.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this concept because I guarantee listeners are analyzing this and spotting a massive potential loophole.
What's the loophole?
Isn't it incredibly convenient for a flawed human being to create a cosmic, supreme God that perfectly validates all of our darkest, most destructive impulses? Is Jung just engaging in high-level intellectual gymnastics to avoid taking personal responsibility for his own shadow? If I can just blame Abraxas for the evil, destructive urges I feel, then I never have to feel bad about my own malice or my own capacity for cruelty.
It is a very sharp critique,
Yeah.
and honestly, it's a trap many people fall into when studying this material. But Jung's clinical psychological intent is actually the exact opposite of avoiding responsibility.
Yes.
By personifying these dark, chaotic, irrational forces, by giving them distinct names and faces like Abraxas or the devil or the serpent Jung, isn't excusing them or giving himself permission to act them out. He is actively stopping his conscious ego from identifying with them.
Explain the mechanism there. How does naming the monster keep you safe from it?
Think of the human psyche like a large house. The ego is the perfectly curated living room where you entertain guests.
Everything looks nice and clean.
Right. The shadow is the dark basement where you throw all the broken, ugly, socially unacceptable junk you refuse to acknowledge. If you deny that the basement exists, if you refuse to look at the dark forces of your own nature, those forces don't just disappear.
They sit down there and fester.
Worse, they operate secretly behind your back. You become entirely controlled by your unconscious shadow, lashing out at people, acting destructively, all while your ego remains utterly convinced that you are a perfectly rational, good person.
We all know people like that.
We do. Jung realized that the only way to avoid being secretly possessed by the darkness is to walk down into the basement, turn on the light, and objectively recognize the monsters that live there. By recognizing the infimum malum as an objective reality within the human psyche, you differentiate yourself from it.
You see it as separate from you.
Yes, you acknowledge the darkness so that you can consciously choose how to relate to it, rather than being its blind puppet.
That makes perfect mechanical sense. You cannot fight, negotiate with, or integrate a monster that you refuse to admit is in the room. And that agonizing process of differentiation, of separating the conscious ego from the cosmic mythological entities of the unconscious, leads us perfectly into the final and perhaps most important phase of Jung's life. How did all of these deeply personal, bizarre, mystical visions translate into the foundational clinical psychology that we utilize every day?
That translation is the true mark of Jung's genius. He didn't just descend into the underworld and stay there as a mystic.
He didn't get lost in the sauce.
No, he brought the psychological treasure back up to the surface and subjected it to the rigors of science. Jung explicitly stated later in life that the Red Book was the raw, molten magma of his psyche. The entire remainder of his life, all of his subsequent, highly academic scientific publications, his massive, multi-volume collected works, were simply his lifelong attempt to cool that magma down into a solid, crystallized empirical structure.
A structure that the 20th century scientific community could actually digest and use to heal patients.
Exactly. He had to translate the language of madness into the language of medicine.
Let's look at some of the bedrock concepts that emerge from this fire. Introversion and extroversion terms that are so ubiquitous today, we put them on our dating profiles. Where did they actually originate?
They evolved directly out of Jung trying to map the intense conflict of opposing forces he experienced in his visions. He was analyzing the friction between Elijah and Salome, between the pull of the inner world and the demands of the outer world.
So it started as a deeply personal conflict.
Yes. He realized there are fundamental directions of psychological energy. The introverted pole is the energy of the soul personality. Number 2, diving into the subjective depths of the inner world. The extroverted pole is the spirit of the times, the energy required to adapt, succeed, and relate to the objective outer world.
That makes so much sense.
And this framework didn't just explain his visions, it finally gave him the clinical vocabulary to explain why his split with Freud was so irreconcilable.
How so?
Freud's entire system was extroverted, focused on the individual's relation to outer objects in society. Jung's system was introverted, focused on the subject's relation to their inner archetypal reality. They were looking at the same psyche from opposite gravitational poles.
And what about the concept of the midlife crisis? Jung essentially drafted the entire modern architectural blueprint for adult developmental psychology through his concept of individuation.
He did. He realized, based on his own devastating breakdown at the age of 38, that human psychological development does not end at adulthood.
We don't just figure it out at 25 and stop growing.
Not at all. Life is fundamentally divided into two halves. The first half of life is entirely about adaptation. It is the realm of personality number 1. Your psychological task is to build a strong ego, establish a career, find a mate, conform to societal expectations, and essentially build a functional persona or mask.
But the tragedy of modern life is that most people think the persona is all there is. They reach midlife, they have the house, the career, the family, and suddenly they are hit with this crushing, inexplicable depression and a feeling of profound emptiness.
Exactly. Because to enter the second half of life successfully, you cannot just keep building the ego. You must undergo a metanoia, a fundamental, often painful psychological transformation.
You have to change direction.
The energy must turn inward. You have to descend into the basement. You must integrate the shadow you ignored and reconnect with the anima or animus, the soul you starved while you were busy paying a mortgage and building a resume.
The ultimate goal of this individuation process isn't to become morally perfect, though. The goal is wholeness. It is the terrifying realization that the ego, the I that you think you are, is not the master of the house.
Right. It's just a guest.
The ego is just a tiny cork bobbing on the surface of a massive ancient ocean. True psychological health requires shifting the center of gravity away from the fragile ego and aligning it with what Jung called the self.
The self, written with a capital S.
Right.
In Jungian psychology, the self is the total encompassing totality of both the conscious and unconscious mind. It is the ultimate center of the psyche. And as Jung progressed through the latter years of writing the Red Book, his visual representations of his inner journey shifted dramatically.
He stopped drawing the mythological figures.
Yes, he stopped painting the dragons and prophets, and he spontaneously began drawing these incredibly intricate, highly structured geometric circular patterns. These were mandalas.
The most famous of which is the Systema Meditatius, a breathtaking, cosmologically complex mandala he painted in 1916. But what is the actual psychological mechanism here? Why does drawing a geometric circle stabilize a fractured mind?
Well, mandalas are ancient, cross-cultural symbols of wholeness and cosmic order. Jung realized that when the psyche is under immense stress, when it is desperately trying to heal itself and integrate the chaotic, overwhelming energy of the unconscious with the rational order of the conscious mind, it spontaneously produces these geometric patterns of balance.
It's like the mind naturally seeks symmetry to soothe itself.
Exactly. The act of drawing the mandala forces the mind to establish a center, to balance opposing forces symmetrically around that center. It is the psyche drawing a blueprint of the self. The mandala acts as a psychological anchor, creating order out of the magma.
But eventually, even the most profound experiment must come to an end. Jung worked on this red letter folio for years, painstakingly painting these mandalas, transcribing the calligraphy, and documenting his descent. And then, quite abruptly, around 1928, the work simply ceases.
It just stops.
The final painting in the book, a beautiful mandala, is actually left unfinished. The calligraphy stops mid-sentence. To me, an abrupt halt like that screams of an external interruption. It's as if he suddenly got the answer he had been agonizing over for 15 years and he simply didn't need to dig in the dirt anymore. Why did he stop?
You are exactly right. The answer arrived from the outside. In 1928, a renowned sinologist named Richard Wilhelm, who had been translating ancient Eastern texts, sent Jung a copy of a newly translated ancient Chinese Taoist alchemical text called The Secret of the Golden Flower.
And what happens when Jung reads this 1,000-year-old document?
It completely shatters his isolation. He reads this ancient text on Chinese alchemy and the circulation of the light, and he realizes with absolute shock that it is describing the exact same psychological processes, the exact same integration of opposites, and the exact same mandala symbolism that he had been agonizingly pulling out of his own isolated modern mind in Switzerland.
So he realizes he didn't just make it all up.
He realized definitively that he wasn't crazy. His intensely private, seemingly bizarre psychological journey had exact, objective historical parallels in ancient alchemy and Eastern philosophy.
The subjective inner world finally connected with the objective outer world.
Yes, the contents of the Red Book had found their way into historical actuality. He suddenly had the empirical, historical proof he needed to show that the collective unconscious was a universal human reality. He realized he didn't need to keep searching the underworld for answers. His confrontation with the unconscious was complete. His confrontation with the world had begun.
And he lived that myth for the rest of his life. He literally traded the calligrapher's pen for the stonemason's trowel. He went out to the edge of the lake in Bollingen and spent years physically building a stone tower, carving his archetypal symbols into the very walls, grounding his inner visions into physical reality.
It's a beautiful conclusion to that chapter of his life.
So, after examining this monumental text, what is the ultimate takeaway? Why does a century-old red-leather diary matter to you, the listener, navigating the complexities of the modern world today? For me, the Red Book fundamentally redefines what it actually means to heal.
It changes the entire paradigm.
We are conditioned to believe that mental well-being means being normal. We think it means being purely rational, productive, and successfully locking all of our weird, dark, messy, irrational thoughts in a psychological closet so we can just function at our jobs.
And Jung's entire life stands as a testament against that sterile definition of health. The Red Book teaches us that true psychological wholeness requires immense bravery. It requires the courage to consciously face, negotiate with, and integrate the chaotic, ancient, and deeply irrational parts of our own minds.
We can't just ignore them.
We can't. We all possess a spirit of the depths operating silently beneath our modern spirit of the times. Every single one of us has an Elijah and a Salome, a rational intellect and a blind, passionate desire, sitting together in the dark, crystalline structures of our unconscious.
This isn't just an obscure historical text for academics or clinical psychoanalysts. This book is a lifeline for anyone going through a midlife transition and feeling hopelessly lost. It is for anyone feeling deeply alienated and suffocated by a purely logical, algorithm-driven modern world.
It really gives you permission to explore your own depths.
It is for anyone who wants to take their inner monologue, their vivid dreams, and their spontaneous imagination seriously. Your mind isn't just a biological machine designed to help you pay bills and answer emails. It is a profound, ancient myth-making engine.
And Jung's legacy, the fact that he survived his descent and returned to build a framework that healed millions, is the ultimate proof that if you find the courage to face the terrifying depths of your own psyche, you do not have to be destroyed by it. You can find a vital new spring of life.
If you enjoyed this exploration and want to continue examining the most transformative ideas in psychology and human growth, please make sure you subscribe to the Book Nook so you never miss an upcoming deep dive.
And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us which book you'd like us to explore next. We read every single one.
Before we conclude, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We began this deep dive discussing the profound comfort of the medical X-ray, the deep human desire for clean, binary, black and white answers in a fundamentally messy world. But Jung spent 16 years proving that the murky, chaotic waters of the mind hold treasures and truths that the X-ray can never possibly capture.
So true.
If you were to sit down in a quiet room tonight, intentionally switch off your conscious, rational mind and engage in your own practice of active imagination, if you walked down the stone stairs into your own psychological basement, what forgotten archetype, repressed fear, or hidden voice would be the first to step out of the shadows and speak to you? And more importantly, are you brave enough to listen?